Hi friends, Dale Sanders here. Looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you about artificial intelligence in healthcare. Let me share my screen and we will get started here. Let's go back a slide. So today's title is Applications of Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is working, what's not, and why. And so let's dive into it. Here are just sort of the typical related disclosures and affiliations. I have a number of different financial relationships that overlap with this space. And I note it down here. There are overlaps between what I advocate in the industry and my financial interests. I tend to put my money where my mouth is, but I try my best to advocate for the country and patients first and foremost, regardless of financial gain. So I hope that I've achieved that in today's presentation for all of you. Bottom line up front, this is our mission as data and information professionals, is to enable this conversation between a patient and their clinical team, or maybe even at some point their avatar. So bear with me while I read this statement. And I want you to think about the data and the AI behind the scenes that would enable this conversation. Okay, there's data and AI all over this this sentence. So here we go. I can make a health optimization recommendation for you, informed not only by the latest clinical trials, but also by local and regional data about patients like you, the real world health outcomes over time of every patient like you, and the level of your interest and ability to engage in your own care. In turn, I can tell you within a specified range of confidence which treatment or health management plan is best suited for a patient specifically like you and how much that will cost. Like I said, there's data behind all of that, right, friend? Recommendation engines, clinical trials data, local and regional data about patients like you, so that we're addressing geography and social determinants in your area. There's outcomes data required here, patient-reported outcomes ideally. The level of interest and ability to engage in your own care, those are patient activation measures, social determinants of health. And then with predictive models and pattern recognition, we can recommend with confidence the treatment and health management plan that's best suited for patients and how much that will cost. All right, so there you go. That's the bottom line up front. That's what I think we should all be aspiring to, is to enable with technology and artificial intelligence that conversation. Okay, so I want to start off with a few assertions, and then I will support these assertions with evidence during the course of the presentation. So today's assertion number one is, where is artificial intelligence and machine learning poised to make a difference? It's especially relevant in life sciences, especially protein folding and drug discovery, where it rapidly accelerates human hypothesis generation. And I'll emphasize a lot about hypothesis generation as a key, important way to apply AI effectively in healthcare. So life sciences, protein, chemical discovery, drug discovery, no doubt about it, we're going to see a lot of rapid improvement in drug discovery times as we go forward. Where is AI making an impact, but the jury is still out? This is assertion number two. Unfortunately, I think we all hope the diagnostic imagery would help or benefit from AI, but so far, not so much. There are problems with overfitting and underfitting and biases in training sets. And I'll discuss this in greater detail in subsequent slides. And the third assertion here is, where has AI and machine learning essentially underperformed so far? And that is optimizing therapeutic treatment for patients. And the reasons for that are primarily driven by the poor data quality that we see in EHRs. And we're starting to realize that EHR data is actually a very tiny slice of a patient's health data picture. And so we can't be patient-centric with our applications of AI until we improve our data quality and broaden what we define as available data for AI to analyze and expose for treatment to patients. Okay, now let's talk about a few concepts here that affect the way we should think about AI and machine learning. This is the world that I grew up in prior to my career in healthcare. I was an Air Force officer. I also was a threat analyst for the National Security Agency, and satellite operations, space operations was a big part of my job. So I grew up around rockets and missiles and satellites and things like that that were bathed in sensors. And we were analyzing that telemetry and that data from those systems for basically the same reasons that we should be analyzing data for humans. And that is, it was all about spacecraft health monitoring. This is a really good paper published in IEEE a couple of years ago that talks about how to apply a data-driven approach to health monitoring of satellites using probabilistic clustering and dimensionality reduction. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about clustering today and the use of clustering to improve patient health. Also in this paper, I think it's interesting that the satellite telemetry data actually looks a lot like the kind of data we should be collecting in healthcare about patients. In the satellite world, there's high dimensionality. That means that there's hundreds to thousands of different data variables, typically associated with the data package on a spacecraft. Multimodality is an important part of data collection, you know, just like humans, right? We have day and night modes for satellites, pediatric and adult, sleeping and awake. The data that we pull off of satellites is very heterogeneous. It includes continuous real values and discrete categorical values. So you can think of humans in this context, you know, in an ICU with continuous real values and discrete categorical values like, you know, ICDs, SNOMEDs, and that kind of thing. And then there's a temporal dependence on the data too, and that what time you collect the data matters. So the temporal dimension between heterogeneous data also matters a lot. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about, but timing of data collection and analysis is super important. And of course, there's always missing data, and sometimes missing data is good. Sometimes it's okay. If a nurse decides not to take vitals at 2 a.m. and let a patient rest, that's actually probably an indication that the patient's in pretty good health. It's not a problem with the data. So understanding when missing data is an anomaly you should be concerned about, and when missing data is okay, is an important part of satellite telemetry data and rocket data as well. So a lot of how I look at healthcare data and healthcare decision-making was formed in my prior life in the Air Force and National Security Agency. And I forgot to mention, I think this is an important bullet. We need to start thinking like electrical engineers. And more electrical engineers out there, the better, because they think in the world of data, they think like we should be thinking in healthcare. So I'm a big advocate for bringing more electrical engineers into healthcare. Another concept here that I like to emphasize is being more aware of sort of classic decision science in healthcare. And starting at the bottom of this layered diagram here, it starts with standard vocabulary and terminology. That is the syntax and the language we use to describe patient treatments, patient demographics, and also patient outcomes. And the truth is, we haven't nailed the standardized vocabulary and terminology in healthcare yet, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we struggle still with repeatable, reusable, and consistent value sets. So, you know, it's one thing to describe sort of the syntax, the codes of, and the language of healthcare. It's another to put that into sentences and paragraphs. And that's essentially what a value set is. When you put those coded elements into sentences and paragraphs about a patient, that becomes a value set. Well, if we're not communicating with a standard language at the lower level and a reasonably consistent description of patients with sentences and paragraphs, then the upper layers of this stack will suffer. And that is, we can't follow classic decision science with situational awareness, like what's going on, what's going on with the patient, what does it mean, then start generating hypotheses. What should we do in response to this situation with this patient, with this population of patients with COVID? And then finally, taking intervention and monitoring their interventions. How did we do and how should we adapt, and closing that loop back on situational awareness. These are sort of the classic decision science concepts that I was exposed to in the military and national intelligence community. And sometimes I don't think we think in this simple but super important framework when we make decisions in healthcare. So a little bit more about that later too. So ultimately, this slide depicts what I think all of us as patients would like to see, but it's also in one form or another what providers, payers, life sciences, and public health constituents are interested in as well. And that is, we're trying to understand patients like me, patients like this, who were treated like this, had outcomes like this. So we're trying to understand that prospectively. We're also looking at it retrospectively to inform our prospective decision-making. And these are the data items and the terminology required to inform each of those overlapping parts of the Venn diagram here. So for patients like me, we're largely, described by diagnosis, demographics, social determinants of health, genomics, vitals, and lab results. If you give me a raw data set of that type, I can start building really effective patient cohorts, right? That's the foundation of this three-part diagram. Patient cohorting is where it all starts. The second thing is then understanding the orders and interventions affiliated with the treatment of the patient cohort of concern. And that boils down to medications, procedures, and patient-initiated care on their own. And there should be dialogue, vocabulary, terminology in that patient-initiated space as well. Coded things that we can compute. Finally, the last thing is understanding the outcomes. Given that the patient cohort was treated in a particular way, then what are the outcomes that we need to understand in order to optimize care for the next patient? And that data is inherently dependent on patient-reported outcomes, quality of life indicators, cause of death, which is the data quality of cause of death in the US is pretty bad right now. And then, of course, cost of care is an important part of an outcome as well. So these are all either discrete or categorical data types informed by terminology. And this is all covered in one form or another by narrative descriptions in a clinician and patient recorded note. And the language that we use over here in the clinical note must make sense in the context of these coded terminologies on the left-hand side. And so NLP is super important, right? You can kind of think of this world as categorical, discrete, computable data. This is the world of NLP over here on the right-hand side. Temporality is a little different. It sits a little bit between narrative text and coded text. But understanding the progression of disease, onset of symptoms, it's super important that we understand the temporality of disease as it relates to outcomes, because quite often it has an impact on quality and length of life, right? So every market segment, certainly as patients, we'd like to see this. Providers are always interested in trying to progress through this as optimally as possible. Payers are trying to reduce risk and maximize outcomes. Life sciences are trying to understand the effects of drugs and new drug development in the progression of this. And of course, in public health, this is super important too at the population level. Okay. This is a bit of an eye chart. I won't spend much time on it, but this is I authored this healthcare analytics adoption model, gosh, almost 10 years ago. This is the 2021 version. I updated it a little bit last year. HIMSS uses a version of this. I licensed it to them for free so that they could conduct audits on organizations. I bring this up today because the truth is AI and machine learning don't really appear much until you get to level 5 and above. So you almost draw a curve that says, the beginnings of AI and machine learning start to emerge at level 5. They're super important to achieve level 8 in the analytics adoption model. But in order to get to level 5 and above, you have to establish a very solid foundation. You have to take care of the basics first. And that's what we're not doing very well right now in healthcare, friends, especially at the standardized vocabulary and patient registries layer. And of course, we all struggle with generating, internal basic reporting and external reporting. But the whole goal here is to nail everything at level 4 and below so that AI and machine learning can be accelerated in levels 5 and above. All right. Okay, now just a reflection on, what does it mean to become digitized? It comes in 2 parts. First, you have to digitize the assets you're trying to manage and optimize. So in the case of the airline industry, the design of aircraft now is digitized. The whole experience of being a patient is now digitized. And that's where you start digitizing the processes as a second step. So digitize your assets, like luggage, aircraft arrival, flight times, crew availability, that kind of thing. Then digitize your processes. And so what we've done in healthcare is we've digitized our processes for an encounter, but we really haven't digitized the patient. So an EHR is a far cry from a digitized patient, right? What we've really done is kind of backwards in terms of a digital strategy. We digitize the processes first rather than the assets. So we need to step back now, friends, and we need to start thinking about how we actually digitize the patient, not just registration, scheduling encounters, all that kind of thing, not the processes so much, but the patients. I like to use this, especially when I'm communicating with executives and things who are new to artificial intelligence. AI in a computer is basically analogous to the real intelligence, not the artificial intelligence that all of us process every day in our brains. And it all boils down to some form of pattern recognition, then deciding what to do with the patterns that you see. And so for us, if we're looking at a group of people, right, the retina serves as our data collection system for feature extraction. We're looking at faces, sizes, colors of skin, hair, the way people are dressed, right, the reaction on their faces. Those are feature extractions. If I were giving this lecture to all of you in an audience, I'd be doing that right now. I'd be looking at the audience, doing feature extraction, kind of wondering, are you engaged in the lecture or not? Should I adjust the way that I'm presenting? And that's what's happening then in the cerebral cortex, right? Once we start extracting features using our retina, then we start classifying and clustering people into groups, right? Or, it could be anything. It could be cars, it could be anything, but the process is still the same. And the more you cycle through, the more experiences you have in this cycle of feature extraction to classification and clustering, the better you will be the next time you encounter this situation as a human. That's the same exact process that we are trying to mimic using, machine learning and AI in computers. And of course, there are many types of patterns, right? There are visual patterns, temporal patterns, sonic, logical. Certainly one of the more complex patterns that we're dealing with right now is the hype around autonomous vehicles in very complex urban settings. I have my doubts about whether we're ever going to be really good at that, but we'll see. But yeah, there's all sorts of different patterns in life that we can apply machines to understand, the same kind of thing that we do with a human. But the truth is, a human cannot process super complex patterns fast enough. It's just impossible. But what we can do with machines is process lots of data and expose those patterns from the computer to a human to interpret. And that's what we're really good at, is interpretation of patterns once presented to us. And so you'll hear me talking about the importance of pattern recognition in AI in the next few slides. So this was a really important paper that came out now a long time ago, but it still holds up. And there was always this debate in the AI community about, gosh, we don't have much data, but we have these really sophisticated models. I think we can overcome a lack of data. And then there were folks in AI who said, no, data is the most important thing. You can never overcome a lack of data with complex models. So they ran a very sophisticated bake-off, testing dozens of different models with small data sets, large data sets. And this quote sums up the paper, and that is, invariably, simple models and a lot of data trump more elaborate models based on less data. So data volume is key to success in AI. The more volume, the better. Now you have to be careful, right? High volume data that's biased can actually make the model perform poorly. So biases in data is super important. But as a general rule, the more data, the better. And again, that kind of applies to human beings, right? The more experiences you have in life, the better you are at pattern recognition, right? That's one of the great things about getting older. I've been exposed to a lot of patterns. So my pattern recognition skills are pretty good right now, thanks to all the different experiences I've had in life. So data volume matters, okay? Super important principle. And I'll just point out that in terms of data volume, we're not big data in healthcare yet. Most of the data that we collect is actually, administrative data, and it's redundant data. It's not new data. I've had to calculate this number as a CIO a number of times. I've had to calculate this number for patients, to budget out my storage and that kind of thing. And it hasn't changed in 15 years. So on average, we are collecting about 100 megabytes of data per patient per year. Now, there are some patients who don't visit the healthcare system very often, and we're not collecting much of any data on them. Then there are, ICU patients where we're collecting a lot of data. But generally speaking, we are not collecting much data on patients. And if you compare that to what's being collected in automobiles nowadays and in airlines, it's minuscule, right? 30 terabytes of data in 8 hours for a Tesla, for example, 5 to 8 terabytes in a 4-hour flight of a Boeing 767. So if you go back to that previous slide, data volume matters to successful AI. This is one of the reasons we're not being as successful with AI in healthcare, is because we just don't have enough data. So there are ways to adjust to that, though, so that we can take advantage of the benefits of AI, even though we don't have much data. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using AI. It's just we need to be smarter about our expectations and how we employ it. And I use this as a metaphor. That's a picture that was taken with my family skiing just a couple of days ago, actually. And that's my real life on the left, right? And I included my family because that's part of my social determinants of health. My healthcare strategy should be informed by my entire life. And my kids and my wife are an important part of my healthcare strategy. Unfortunately, on the right, this is healthcare's digital view of my life right now. It's highly pixelated. So we have to spend some time rounding out and increasing the pixel density so that healthcare has a better understanding of my total life, so we can optimize care for me and everyone else. And this is a cartoon that I drew, 15 years ago almost now, when I was at Northwestern. This amounted to our strategic data acquisition plan at Northwestern. This is the data that we need to increase the pixelation, or rather reduce the pixelation in the previous slide. So let's go after this proactively, friends. As healthcare data professionals, we should be pushing this agenda. That if we want to understand the patient at the center, we need to do something more than just look at EHR, encounter data, and claims data. We've got to start folding all of these data sources into a complete picture of the patient at the center, and then exposing it to our care teams in a way that they can actually use it. So if I were still an operational healthcare CIO or chief analytics officer, I would lay these bubbles down on a timeline, and this would amount to my strategic data acquisition strategy for the next 5 to 10 years. So one of the super important principles that we need to adopt, in addition to the collection, the deliberate collection of this data represented in the cartoons, is we need to adopt as a national principle the reduction of dependence on human entered data. We cannot keep burdening clinicians with more data entry. Again, going back to my previous life, I grew up in the world of sensors and passive data collection. And that's the way we should start thinking about healthcare. We should start thinking about digitizing patients, the assets that we need to manage healthcare, and stop asking nurses and physicians to be our data entry clerks. It's what you guys all know. It's a terrible thing that we're doing to our clinicians, and we can't keep doing it. And it's not even giving us very good data. There's all sorts of data problems in what we're forcing those humans to collect. Now there is some hope. The emergence of biointegrated electronics is maturing. I'm a big fan of the folks at Northwestern. John Rogers leads that group, and they are doing some amazing things with biointegrated electronics. So collecting sensor type data, so kind of treating humans as a satellite, right? So we bathe humans in sensors, and we collect that data to monitor their health and their behavior. So keep an eye on this. This is super important, super interesting stuff. John Rogers at Northwestern, I think, is the best in the world at this. And to give you an example of some of the things they're doing, they're producing these microns thin, 1-inch square skin pliable sensors. And inside those sensors, they have a Bluetooth antenna, a CPU, physiologic monitors, and wireless power. They're the coolest things in the world. They're so thin, they use van der Waals forces for adhesives. They don't use typical adhesives that sometimes can be very irritating to patients. And the good news is, one of the great early success stories were the use of these sensors in NICUs. This was published in IEEE. So, these poor little fragile babies that are in the NICU benefit enormously from cuddling and skin-to-skin contact with their parents and their loved ones. And so mortality is pretty high for these babies, in part because they can't be cuddled. Well, with John and his team's sensors, these babies now aren't wired up in such a way that it restricts that cuddling. And so the kangaroo effect, it's called, has had a big impact on reducing NICU mortality. This is just the beginning of what's possible, friends. So keep an eye on these biointegrated sensors. Okay, now let's talk about AI in healthcare, more specifically where it's working, where it's not, and why. So one of the big exciting things, in my opinion, I have a chemistry undergrad and a biology undergrad, so I'm always kind of attracted back to chemistry and physics. AI modeling of 3D modeling of protein structures is a big breakthrough. So Google made their AlphaFold 2 models and framework open source a couple of years ago. And it's having just this enormously valuable breakthrough in helping scientists understand more quickly and generate faster hypotheses about how these protein structures will be, how they'll fold. And it's, as you all probably know, how a protein folds matters a lot in terms of its effectiveness in the drug world. So, and you have to keep in mind, that the new drug discovery requires 12 years and $2.6 billion on average. And a lot of that time is spent on experimenting and hypothesis generation on failed hypotheses, right? Well, with AlphaFold, now you can greatly accelerate by orders of magnitude accurate hypotheses so that you're not spending your time on dead-end hypotheses. You're spending your time on hypotheses that will have a great payoff for new drugs and things. So big deal in the protein and chemical discovery world. That's the good news. Now, image analysis is promising, but it's problematic. And this paper just came out, was just a few days ago, actually. And this group studied machine learning for medical imaging, the sort of the methodological failures and recommendations for future, like how come imaging isn't benefiting more from AI when we all thought it would? And this is what they concluded. Despite great promises, the extensive research in medical applications of machine learning seldom achieves a clinical impact. Studying the academic literature and data science challenges reveals these troubling trends. Number one, accuracy on diagnostic tasks progresses slower on research cohorts that are closer to real life settings. So in other words, what's happening, in research cohorts is not really happening in real life settings. Methods research is often guided by data set availability rather than clinical relevance. So when you want to test an image analysis algorithm, you're kind of restricted by the data you can have. So you get biased by just data selection from the very beginning, rather than the data that really matters in day-to-day clinical care. And then finally, many developments of model bring improvements smaller than the evaluation errors. Finally, and I thought this was really interesting, the challenges start with the choice of data sets. They're plagued by model evaluation, and they're amplified by publication incentives, sort of the careerism of academic research. So image analysis is not living up to what I thought it would, and these are some of the reasons. So hopefully we can start addressing these and really bring AI to the benefit of patients and also to clinicians. And I would say that scalable AI for patient care is just not happening yet, friends. This was a great paper published in 2019. Marzai Ghasemi, if you don't follow anybody else in the AI space, I would suggest you follow Marzai. She's brilliant, both technically as well as philosophically. And a lot of, AI success, frankly, is sort of philosophical. More on that later. But this was a good quote from that paper, and that is, diseases in EHRs, why does that thing keep advancing? Sorry. Diseases in EHRs are poorly labeled. Conditions can encompass multiple underlying endotypes, and healthy individuals are underrepresented in data sets. So this paper serves as a primer to eliminate these challenges and highlight opportunities for members of the machine learning community to contribute to healthcare. So what you'll hear and read in this paper is sort of meta philosophical ways to approach AI. It's less technical and more about, gosh, you just need to think about the data and the metadata that you're looking at, and the content of the data and the biases in the data. It's not very technical. This was a paper that was published, or a summary that was published in July of 2021. It was actually a summary of an article that came out in British Medical Journal and The Lancet. And out of 457 COVID models, none were deemed clinically acceptable. And so what went wrong, right? It's the poor quality of the data the researchers have to develop their tools. And what should we do to fix it? Well, getting a hold of data that would be easier if formats were standardized, right? Getting back to my previous slide about the importance of standardized syntax and vocabulary. We are woefully inadequate in the adoption of LOINC and RxNorm, and the way we use ICD, the way we use SNOMED. So we've got to improve the quality of the data at a very low level in that stack, the standardized vocabulary, before we can hope to achieve the best out of AI. Finally, and this theme here, this is a great website. Highly, highly recommend all of you spend time with this. It's fascinating. And it concluded after, these folks that did this research concluded after scrubbing almost 200,000 published abstracts, looking for evidence of AI in the abstract, like, was this study affiliated with AI in some fashion? They found 43,000 total studies that included AI model development. And of those 43,000, only 3,629 were deemed mature development stage. So lots was published, but less than, only about 8% of the published papers in healthcare are actually defendable when it comes to AI. So you can see this is a real-time graph of, these are the mature studies. These are all included. So you can see this hockey stick effect in what's being published, but not nearly as steep a curve in terms of what's actually mature. And then also on this page, you can see the latest clinical AI studies. Really cool website, great work from the folks at Lancet in Digital Health. This paper came out in March of 2021. Again, some folks from Google. And the headline sort of captures everything, and that is, everyone wants to do the model work, not the data work. And the paper talks about what they call data cascades in high stakes AI. So we're all kind of in love with being data scientists and doing the algorithm work and doing the model work. But the truth is, if you have data problems, there's no amount of good modeling or algorithms are going to take that are going to overcome those poor data quality situations. So this, again, is a quote that sums it up nicely. Data quality carries an elevated significance in high stakes AI due to its heightened downstream impact, impacting predictions like cancer detection, for example. Paradoxically, data is the most undervalued and deglamorized aspect of AI. So data quality is what it's all about, friends, and we have a real data quality problem in healthcare. And it all starts really with the EHR data. There's a huge dependence downstream on EHR data. Public health depends on it. Patient care depends on it. Life sciences depends on it. Payers depend upon it. And of course, we depend upon it. So if you look at the cascading effects of poor data quality, it goes across every segment of the industry, and which is why we have to start focusing more time and effort on improving EHR data quality. And I would suggest that quality measures are wrecking EHR data quality. We're wasting physician data entry time on quality measures that aren't working for our benefit to reduce the cost quality curve. This paper was published in the New England Journal about 2 years ago. And it was a look back on the beginnings of the National Quality Task Force, sort of the emergence of quality measures as a formal part of US healthcare. And Don Berwick, who is one of the early champions of measuring quality, was on this paper. And these quotes sum up the state of affairs about quality measures. And that is, what is primarily missing is not progress in measurement. We're measuring physicians all the time, but progress in results. We're not seeing any impact on the cost quality curve in the US. If anything, it's getting worse. So therefore, the hope that was reflected in the founding of the National Quality Forum, the developing, certifying, and using sound metrics of the quality of healthcare would drive fundamental improvement, remains largely unrequited. So I'm telling you, friends, as professionals and as taxpayers, we need to raise our voice to CMS and to the payers and say, let's step back, and instead of focusing so much on these quality measures that are not doing anything but burning physicians out, let's go back to collecting raw, granular data about patients like me who were treated like this, had outcomes like this. And if we collect those raw data attributes in each one of those 3 pieces of the diagram, we can repurpose that data for any kind of quality measure that we care to dream up. But it starts with granular data about patients like me who were treated like this, had outcomes like this. Back to that diagram. We all talk about the importance of text data, like, wow, the text data is the holy grail and natural language processing is going to solve all of our data problems. But I think those of us who have been around clinical notes know that they're not always very good, right? They're highly motivated, their content's highly motivated by reimbursement and defensive medicine, and also just throughput for the clinicians, right? They're just rushing to get through because of this volume-based fee-for-service model that we have. And so this paper that came out a few years ago, I don't think this has changed much, indicated that in a typical note, 18% of the text was manually entered, 46% was copied from someplace else, and 36% was imported from a template. That's not, our natural language processing is only going to be as good as the data that we enter into these notes. And so I really wish we could take a national strategy on optimizing the quality of the clinical note for patient care, as opposed to billing, reimbursement, and defensive medicine. And I actually think we could make life easier for clinicians too. I think we can encourage them to shorten their notes with more succinct but really high value insights. Then our NLP would benefit as a consequence. And of course, our AI that leverages NLP would benefit. As if that's not enough about our EHR data quality problem, this paper studied, they put an observer in the room with a patient and a physician, and they studied to see if what was discussed in the exam room actually made its way into the EHR in an accurate way. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out very, very good. In a review of systems with a clinician, 61.5% of the time, what was entered in the EHR did not reflect the reality of the encounter. And in the case of physical exams, 47% of the time, almost half of the EHR data did not reflect reality. So there's something going on between that encounter with the patient and the physician and what gets into the EHR, and the two are just not lining up. So we've got an EHR data quality problem, friends, and we've got to figure out how to address that. Otherwise, artificial intelligence in healthcare will continue to underperform. We always think that outcomes data is super important, and randomized clinical trials are sort of the gold standard for data. But this paper indicated that 49% of the randomized clinical trials that were published were deemed high risk for wrong conclusions because of missing or poor measurement of outcomes data. So outcomes is the last piece of that three-part diagram, right? Patients like this who were treated like this had outcomes like this. We have to collect high quality outcomes data. And if we don't, even our clinical trials that are published and that are followed for protocol development and things are going to suffer. And so this is a lesson that I brought with me from my time in the space and defense sector. I had a very dear friend and mentor. He was a data scientist. He was more of a physicist, but we were in the early stages of what I would call formal AI back in the early 90s. And he would always remind us, let the model fluctuate around the data, as opposed to imposing a model on data, like a priori imposition of a model like FHIR or OMOP. Just collect raw data, let your algorithms expose the model, then decide what to do with the model. But data science is all about making sense of raw data and sometimes noisy data, right? In healthcare, we're too focused on data models like FHIR and OMOP, instead of collecting just raw granular data attributes, as I indicated in that three-part diagram, regardless of the model. And I always say, give me raw data and I can model it in a number of different ways. Now, I am encouraged that US CDI version 3 is a step in the right conceptual direction. It's going to be a challenge to get there, but we're moving away from sort of FHIR data collection to just data attributes, more like you would see an electrical engineer apply a data package to a spacecraft. And here's an example of where clustering, and letting the data speak for itself as opposed to imposing a model is super effective, which is what we should be doing more of in healthcare. So great compliments to Mount Sinai. They published this in 2015 using a combination of supervised and unsupervised clustering of 2,500 type 2 diabetic patients on 73 different features and variables. They found 3 clinically distinct different subtypes of type 2 diabetics that I guarantee a SQL programming data analyst would have never found these subtypes, but the AI algorithm did. So putting more emphasis on clustering is a super important go forward strategy for our country when it comes to AI and machine learning value. Here's another example of that. Big kudos to a company called Droice Labs. And I learned this again at NSA, like when data is messy, look more for patterns that you expose to humans. Don't really try to parse this data for specifics. And this is a great example of how Droice is approaching this conceptually with AI from the right direction. And this is a diagram that said for CKD patients, right? There were 10 million patients found with that CKD diagnosis. They analyzed 15 million episodes, 10 million labs, millions of clinical notes, 4 million prescriptions, all of that getting mashed together into a clustering pattern recognition environment. And these are all clinical subtypes and clusters of a CKD patient. So if you're a life sciences company, if you're a provider, if you're a payer, or if you're a patient, this is a sort of granularity that you'd like to see. And of course, the tighter the cluster, the more likely that this is a meaningful cluster, right? So you can see all of the different subtypes of comorbidities that emerge from these CKD patients. And by the way, these clusters were labeled from clinicians. So the computer, the AI algorithm, didn't label these clusters, Droyce put this data, these clusters in front of clinicians, and the clinicians stepped back and looked at the data and said, well, I think this is this looks like a subtype of patients who have gout. So let's label that cluster with gout. There's another group over here that looks like it's associated with lupus. So it's a human labeling process that helps validate the output here as well. It's not the computer doing that. And I'll share with you why I think this is going to be a bit of a challenge. Here we go. These algorithms are finding clusters that we don't really have syntax to describe yet. So labeling these clusters is going to require a new approach to clinical vocabulary, new approach to syntax. And I would also say that, the future of clinical analytics is not declarative SQL programming, friend. It's R and Python augmented with SQL in some ways, but it's clustering and pattern recognition is where we're headed. Again, this is a paper that was published from some of the folks at Droyce Labs. They're doing really good work in the industry. I'll close this section by talking about the 3 loops of decision-making. So I published a paper back in 2016 that essentially summarized like healthcare decision-making occurs in 3 closed loops. And I would suggest that given our current EHR data quality and UX technology, that is the quality coming out of the EHR, plus our technical challenges in modifying the user experience in an EHR, it's best that we apply AI to the population and protocol loops from now, okay? So at the population loop, you're dealing with millions of patients. You're making decisions that typically emerge over years and decades. I call it mean time to improvement, MTTI. It takes a long time at this population of public health to see the effects of your decision-making. And there's some room for error. You kind of have to be directionally accurate with populations and public health, right? You've got some time to adjust if you've made a mistake in your decision-making. So this is the most error tolerant part of the decision-making process in healthcare. The next level down, then you're slicing those populations into thousands of patients. Now you're starting to group patients into general types. And your mean time to improvement and decision-making here is measured more in years and months. So you still have some time to adjust. I wish we were adjusting protocols faster, frankly, but you do have some time to adjust, right? In general, you're saying this is how a congestive heart failure patient with diabetes should be treated, right? In general. And then finally, the last and the most precise of the decision-making is associated with patients, individual patients. And you're dealing with mean time to improvement in your decision-making here, weeks, days, and even minutes. Unfortunately, our ability to inject AI into this patient loop is pretty well constrained by the EHR right now, technically as well as the data quality. And we don't have the room to make a mistake at this layer like we do at the population protocol layer. So what I would suggest for technical reasons and for state of data quality reasons, that the best use of AI right now is at the population and the protocol level. And we'll eventually get to the patient level, but it's a little too risky to expect too much at the patient level right now. All right, so wrapping things up. This is a common sense framework for AI and machine learning operations. This in itself could take an hour. I won't spend that much more than a couple of minutes on it, but Mark Parody and Mark is I can't remember his official title at Northwell, but he's got a senior title at Northwell in their investment arm. Super smart person, a genuine in the trenches data scientist, and not just technically capable, just conceptually amazingly capable. And he and I have been working on this saying, well, what advice can we give to people about where best to apply AI? And these are the 6 phases of what we call the common sense framework for AI and machine learning operations. So, phase 1, if you're a data scientist, you're kind of beginning with the end in mind. Is the concept for our analysis accurate? Do we have the availability of source data, and how much variability is there? We start data profiling, we start understanding metadata, data quality, data biases, kind of getting a situational awareness for the data itself as it relates to what you're trying to achieve. Then we're going into the exploring phase, right? We get all the data kind of lined up. Now we're going to unsupervised learning. We're just going to let the model fluctuate around the data. What's the data telling us? What does it see? What's going on? Then we'll start generating initial hypotheses and features, okay, from that unsupervised learning. Next, we'll go to pruning. And that is we're going to bring in domain experts and we're going to kind of pass the common sense test on the output. We'll throw away meaningful or meaningless features. We'll keep the ones that mean something to us. We'll start dealing with noise. We'll start initial labeling of clusters. Now we'll step back and say, okay, given what we think we see, can we actually implement this thing in real life? And what could this mean? You know, what do we think we're seeing in the data? We'll start narrowing our hypotheses, okay? Then phase 4 is validating. Now we're going to refine the labels on the clusters. We're going to start fitting this to the real world. We're going to start thinking like randomized clinical trial concepts, you know, holding a comparative versus an experimental group. We're going to have positive and negative controls in the patients that we're evaluating. We're going to leverage declarative SQL analysis in this validation phase as well. So this is where SQL is super important. We're generating hypotheses with AI. Now we're kind of digging into the details with SQL to test those hypotheses and see if there's anything that we are missing. We're going to ask ourselves if temporality matters or not. We're going to start sketching out interventions. And then we're going to start thinking about what should we do to deploy those interventions, which comes in phase 5, and monitoring that. And of course, this is the feedback loop, right? From interventions back to the beginning. And then once we've gone through this loop enough times to feel confident, then we will go into essentially monitoring mode. Okay. This is another thing that I advocate. I call it the digitician. And I borrow this from my world as an intelligence analyst. So an intelligence analyst in the military is responsible for an area of operations, a country, a particular battle space, a particular topic. And that intelligence analyst is responsible for digesting subjective, objective data, any kind of data they can get, computable, non-computable, text, verbal, and synthesizing that for decision makers and then presenting that to, you know, military and civilian decision makers. And what I'm saying is, I think there's room for something like that in healthcare. And I've put the, you know, digitician trademark on it. I kind of like that name because it's a person that understands clinical care as well as data and digitizing patients and things. So different patient types have different data profiles required for their active management of their outcomes in health. For instance, if I go in for a knee replacement, which I'm thinking about doing, there will be a different data profile about me and my treatment than if someone went in for an L4, L5 fusion, or, you know, maybe someone with congestive heart failure and diabetes. There are different data profiles required to manage those different data types or patient types. And again, I'm not talking about quality measures here. I'm talking about telemetry and data about patients themselves and the state of the patient, not the state of the healthcare process. But you know, some people have said, well, is this an evolution of the informatician's job, you know, medical informatics and things? And I think it probably could be, right? I don't know that you need to be a physician to do this. I don't know that you need to be a fully trained medical informaticist to do this. But I do think that it's somewhere a fairly senior job, but not too senior. And it's focused around the metaphor of the intelligence analyst in the military and national intelligence serving the same purpose in healthcare. So that person is synthesizing data, not the physician, not the nurse, and they're presenting that case and that information to those decision makers to optimize care for the patient. I would suggest that you get involved just like you are with HIMSS. I'm a big fan of the Digital Medicine Society. It's been around now, I think, for 2 years. It's a not-for-profit, and it's pushing the agenda of digital medicine on several fronts. So highly encourage some involvement from all of you in the Digital Medicine Society. And I'll start to close out by saying, if I were leading Health and Human Services, this would be one of my strategic goals and statements. I would say that by 2030, every citizen will possess at least 10,000 times more data, coupled with analytics and AI, to support their health optimization than what exists in 2022. So if you recall earlier, we're only collecting about 100 megabytes per patient per year. And again, only those patients that are actually seeking treatment. But I would establish a national goal to collect 1 terabyte of data per patient per year to inform their own care, put patients in charge of that, to share with the healthcare system, and to inform everything about outcomes and therapeutics. I think this is the kind of bold vision that we need for really digitizing the industry. All right, in closing, friends, I would say that our country lacks an overall and visionary data strategy for healthcare. We're doing okay, and I don't mean to be too critical of what's happened, but we just need to be a little bit more bold. Health information exchanges, CCDAs, FHIR, that's just not quite doing it, right? I am encouraged by the new leadership, and COVID has increased, I think, the notion that we have to be more data-driven in the US when it comes to healthcare. So I think there are some positive winds blowing, but I'd like them to blow harder. And as a result, AI and machine learning are largely underperforming, and patients are suffering as a result. So AI, the benefits that we could realize in the industry from artificial intelligence are suffering because we don't have a better visionary data strategy and incentives to be better about the data. And I would say in the healthcare data topic, there's no better informed, capable people than all of you. You're informed as professionals, and you're also super influential as patients. So we have to bring our voice to the federal government to help play a role in this. So I encourage everyone to keep climbing, be vocal, and get involved. All right. Thanks, everybody. I hope that you found this useful. I enjoyed spending time with you, and I look forward to the question and answer session. Have a great day. Bye-bye.